All right, I hope this works. This is the video for the lesson that goes with the algebra tiles. It's been a long time since I've done a Zoom record. I'm not quite sure if this is working or not. I guess we'll find out soon. So before we get to the algebra tiles, I just want to recap what we did in lesson 7.2 because it relates directly to this. So I've got the picture here, which is 2x squared. I can see that there's 11 x's here, and I can see that I got 15 little squares. So just a reminder of what all these little things mean. The x squared is the big squares, the x's are the rectangles, and then on the side here, the little squares, they're your numbers. And once we've done that, we can actually figure out what our factors are going to be. So in module 6, we actually did this in reverse. We put out our factors first, and then we filled in the grid. So module 7 is the reverse. We fill in the grid first, and then we work out what we multiply together to actually make this. So you can see from here, you can see I've already filled in this first part here. So if I was to lay down 2 rectangles here, you can see that that matches up with my squares here. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little squares, so 2x plus 5. What a lot of students started to do was just to count this top row here and say, I got 2 big squares and 5 rectangles, so 2x squared plus 5. So just make sure that you're actually looking what lays down, I guess, on top of this to figure out what your factor is. Now, I didn't fill in the one down the side because I want you to kind of visualize this. It says here that it's going to be x plus 3, but I left this as a sketch pad just so you can kind of see there's one of my x's. And then here I got room for a little square, which would be 1. And hopefully you can see that there would be 3 squares here. So the number of shapes is important, but just remember that the factor is not the same as these shapes. It's the shape that has the same width as this. So for the x squared, it's an x, and for the x's, it's actually 1, and there would be that x minus 3. And if you couldn't visualize it, my picture wasn't very good. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer as to what that is. So just remember, if you actually try and multiplying together 2x plus 5 times x plus 3, drawing the little boxes that we drew, you would actually end up with this answer here. That's what we're trying to do, but just in reverse. Now, last lesson, we looked at what if I give you one of the factors, how do you figure out what the other factor is, which is what this question's asking. The x squared plus 6x plus 8 is your area, and this is the height, and we've got to try and find out the width. So we lay out the rectangles, but we don't put out the squares. So x squared, 1 big square, 8 little rectangles, 8 little squares, I filled them in here. Now I made them so it's the same height as this shape here. So I put out 2, and then I just kept putting out 2 more until I actually got to 8. And from here, I'm kind of hoping that people can start to visualize what this actually looks like. So there's a rectangle here, and if you can see those 4 little squares sliding up here, you could see this would be x plus 4, which is the correct answer. Now, we actually switched very quickly. There you go. You can actually see it a little bit better there, and you can see it even better there if you weren't convinced before. Now, we actually moved into grid questions, but we're going to leave that for today because that's not what's going to be important. We're going to start on looking at algebra tiles for questions where we're not given any factors at all. So notice along the side here, they haven't given us anything at all. And across the top, they haven't given us anything. Now, this one I actually completed ahead of time, but just to show you the structure again. So just remember, you've got to put big squares in the top left, standing up rectangles in the top right, laying down rectangles in the bottom left, and then those little squares in the bottom right-hand corner. So if I'm trying to do this question, all I know is that I need a big square, 11 rectangles, and 24 little squares. Now, I don't put the rectangles out straight away because I don't know what type of rectangles I'm using. Am I using standing up rectangles? Am I using laying down rectangles? And the answer is I don't know. So I'm only going to focus on the squares. Now, when I put out my little squares, I can't do like I did last time and put out like 2 at a time and just keep going until I get to 24. Because I don't know that's the actual height of the shape. So this one has a little bit more ambiguity to it, and we got to figure out what this 24 is. How can I make a rectangle with 24 shapes? With 24 little squares. So I got to think about what numbers multiply together to make 24, and that's normally your starting point. So for this question, it could be 1 and 24, it could be 2 and 12, it could be 3 and 8, and it could be 4 and 6. So how on earth do we decide which of those is actually the correct one that will end up using 11 rectangles? Well, let's take a look. Let's do this very methodically. So I started with 1 by 24, and I'm hoping you can visualize each of the rectangles actually sitting here on top. So if I have 24 little squares across the top here, I must have 24 little rectangles up here as well. And you can clearly see there's space for one rectangle there. So in total, I would have 25 rectangles, which is way too much for this. I only need 11, so I know this is the wrong answer. If you're having trouble visualizing, there you go. Hopefully that will make it a little clearer. So I try something else. I'm going to try 2 by 12. Now you can see that I got my 12 little squares here, and on top of each of these is going to be a rectangle. So I would have 12, and then across the side here, you can see I would have 13 and 14. So actually, this is not the correct answer either. So I'm going to keep going. Just in case you couldn't visualize it, there it is. And I'm going to try 3 by 8. So I can see I've got 8 squares across the top, which means that I would have 8 rectangles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And across the side here, I'd have 1, 2, 3. And 8 plus 3 is 11. So actually, I have my correct answer for this question. And you can see the factors at the top here. If I was to draw my rectangles on little squares, I'm hoping you could see this would be x plus 8. And similarly down the side, I'm hoping you can see that this would be x plus 3. So we didn't actually need to do 4 by 6 because we know that's not the correct answer. So how do I figure out how to set out the little squares? You don't know exactly. There is a little bit of guess into this. You have to try and answer. If it works, obviously stop. But if it's not correct, you have to think of another way of arranging those little squares into a different size rectangle. So there is definitely an element of guesswork to this. Here's that reminder of the format you're going to have to do. You're going to have to put big squares out first, and then those little squares, and then the rectangles, we'll figure out where they go once you've got the little squares out, but it has to follow this format here. So it's really important, after you've got the last big square out, your first little square goes across from it. Too many people are putting little squares up here in the standing rectangles area, or down here in the laying down rectangles area, which makes this really difficult to do. So here's our first little practice question. Unfortunately, I know the answer, so this is not going to be quite as helpful. But basically, I can see I need a big square, 8 rectangles, and 12 little squares. So I already went ahead and dragged out a big square, and I laid out 12 rectangles. So one of the combinations I know certainly for 12 is I could make a 1 by 12. Now, as I'm starting to fill these out, I'm going to stop kind of quickly for this one, because if this is a row with 12 little squares, obviously I would need 12 little rectangles on top, and you can see that's too many. I only need 8. So I'm actually not going to do that row because I can see that that's going to be wrong straight away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 rows of 6. Now, I'm going to show a couple of little tricks here as well. Instead of putting those 6 out there, I'm going to highlight these 6 here. And then if I copy, that also gives me my 12 rectangles, which is a much quicker way of doing it. A couple of other useful tricks on here as well. You can change them into negative tiles by highlighting and clicking negate, but I'm going to leave it like this. Now, I personally can see straight away here. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 6 rectangles here, and I got 2 rectangles here, and that would actually finish off my picture. And 6 add 2 obviously gives me 8, which is what I'm looking for. Now, if we do want to add those rectangles in, algebra, and then algebra tiles, and you can then select whichever shape you want to fill in the little gaps. And I'm just going to copy a few more because I know that I need 6 to go across the top. And I'm just going to drag them into position. Whoops, that one's a little off. There. And there. And there. And remember the reason we're doing this is because we're trying to find out what these factors are, what would go across the top. Now, if you're one of those visual people and you kind of want to lay out the rectangle and the little squares, that's perfectly okay. Some people can kind of just visualize, I got 1 square, so I'd have 1 rectangle across the top here. I got 6 rectangles, so I'd have 6 little squares. And that would give me the factor x plus 6. And I'm going to put it in parentheses because that's normally how we see the answers. And down the side here, I can see there would be 1 rectangle and 2 little squares. So I know that this would be x plus 2. And that's what we're trying to do in these exercises. We're just trying to come up with shapes so we can figure out what the factors are with no clues. So notice we kind of have to use the squares first and then the rectangles later. Don't try dragging out 8 rectangles straight away because you don't know what type of rectangles you're going to use. So you really want to do the squares first. People who tried to do rectangles first found it generally more difficult. And there you can see, there was that answer if you needed the visual. Now you can actually twist the shape the other way around as well. Instead of having 2 by 6, you could have 6 by 2. And all that happens is the factors just switch places. So the x plus 6 was at the top, is on the side. The x plus 6 down the side comes up to the top, and so on. And then from here, you guys can go practice yourself. There's actually 11 different levels, which I wouldn't expect anyone to complete all of them. I think in class, we probably got to about 3 or 4, depending on how long you had to work on it. And then once you get to level 2, then it kind of changes a little bit. So it kind of looks the same. I got my x squared, I got my 10 squares, But notice this time, I don't want 7. I actually want -7. So as I'm putting out my rectangles, instead of putting out positive rectangles, I'm going to put out negative rectangles. And that will be one of the important things as we move through this. When you're filling in the rectangles, you're looking at how many spaces you've got, but you're also trying to figure out, do I want a positive or do I want a negative? I think that concludes it for this one. This was, I would say, this wasn't an official lesson. This was one that we added in and added in a little bit more review time, but it is something that will definitely help when we get further into Module 7.